The secluded mountain escape. Booking the cabin, the idea of escaping to a secluded mountain cabin was a dream come true. As someone who thrived on the peace and beauty of nature, I longed for the tranquility that only the wilderness could provide. The cabin I had chosen was perfect, nestled deep in the mountains, surrounded by dense forest, with the crisp mountain air making every breath feel refreshing. It was far from the hustle and bustle of city life, offering the solitude I craved. Meeting Nick on my first day, I ventured out on one of the many hiking trails near the cabin. That's when I met Nick. He was strikingly handsome, with an air of ruggedness that seemed to blend perfectly with the wilderness around us. We struck up a conversation easily, bonding over our shared love for nature. Nick was staying in a nearby cabin and, like me, was there to reconnect with the great outdoors. We talked about our favorite hiking trails, the best spots to watch the sunrise, and the serenity that only the mountains could offer. Our encounters were pleasant and friendly, with no indication of the darkness that would soon unfold. The change on the third day, everything changed. Nick showed up at my cabin unexpectedly, carrying a bottle of wine. Although surprised, I welcomed him in. We spent the evening chatting, the conversation flowing as naturally as the wine. There was an undeniable spark of attraction, but as the night wore on, Nick's demeanor began to shift. His once friendly banter turned into probing questions about my life, my family, and my fears. A growing sense of unease crept into my mind, but I dismissed it, telling myself that I was just being paranoid. The first sign of danger, it's getting late, Nick. I think it's time to call it a night, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Nick's smile didn't reach his eyes. Of course, Emma. Sweet dreams, he replied, his tone unsettlingly calm. I bolted the door after he left, but sleep didn't come easily. My mind was racing with thoughts of our conversation and the strange vibe I had picked up on. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a fitful sleep. The nightmare begins in the dead of night. I woke up with a start. My heart nearly stopped when I saw Nick standing at the foot of my bed. Before I could scream, he lunged at me, pinning me down with his strong arms, his hand clamping over my mouth to stifle any noise. Shage, don't make this harder than it needs to be, he whispered, his voice cold and devoid of emotion. He dragged me out of bed and forced me down to the cabin's cellar, locking me inside. The cellar was small, dark and damp, with only a tiny window near the ceiling letting in a sliver of moonlight. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I noticed mattresses scattered around, signs that someone had been staying there. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. I wasn't the first person Nick had done this to. Days of terror, I lost track of time in that cellar. Days blurred together as Nick controlled every aspect of my life. He brought me just enough food to keep me alive, but never enough to satisfy my hunger. At night, he tormented me with loud, disturbing noises. I was about to fall asleep. My ears would ring, and my body would tremble from exhaustion, but I couldn't escape the noise. The darkness was equally torturous. Nick would leave me in complete blackness for hours on end. The absence of light played tricks on my mind, making me see shadows that weren't there, hear whispers that didn't exist. My imagination ran wild, conjuring horrors that seemed all too real in the pitch black. The symbols. One day, Nick entered the cellar with a knife in hand. I shrank back in fear, but he didn't approach me. Instead, he began carving strange symbols into the wooden beams of the cellar. The symbols were unlike anything I had ever seen, twisted, angular shapes that made my skin crawl. Why are you doing this? I asked, my voice shaking. Nick paused his carving to look at me, a sinister smile playing on his lips. Because I can. I love breaking people. The coldness in his voice sent a shiver down my spine. You've done this before, haven't you? I whispered, dread washing over me. He didn't respond. Instead, he continued carving the symbols into the beams, the sound of the knife scraping against the wood echoing in the small space. What happened to them? I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. Nick ignored me, his focus entirely on the task at hand. The escape, I knew I had to escape, but the cellar was secured with a heavy lock that seemed impossible to break. I spent hours studying it, trying to find any weakness I could exploit. My opportunity finally came when Nick, in a rare moment of complacency, left a carving tool within my reach. It was small and dull, but it was all I had. With trembling hands, I began working on the lock. The noise from the speakers continued to assault my senses, making it difficult to concentrate. But I refused to give up. Every click of the lock brought me closer to freedom, And finally, after what felt like an eternity, the lock clicked open. A surge of hope washed over me as I slipped out of the cellar. The cabin was eerily quiet, save for the low hum of the speakers. I crept through the darkened cabin, my heart pounding in my chest. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet, and I held my breath, praying that Nick wouldn't hear. When I reached the living room, I saw him. He was sitting on the floor, surrounded by candles, his eyes closed as he meditated in front of the symbols he had carved. His face was a mask of concentration, completely absorbed in whatever twisted ritual he was performing. The final run, I slipped out the back door, the cold night air hitting me like a slap to the face. I didn't hesitate. I ran as fast as I could through the forest, the branches tearing at my clothes and skin. My lungs burned and my legs felt like they were about to give out, but I kept going. The lack of sleep had made me paranoid. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me jump, convinced that Nick was right behind me. Finally, after what felt like hours of running, I saw at a small ranger station, its lights dim but still a beacon of hope. I pounded on the door, screaming for help. When the rangers opened the door, they found me half crazed with fear, covered in cuts and bruises, but alive. Aftermath, the rangers immediately launched a search for Nick, but by the time they arrived at the cabin, it was empty. There was no sign of Nick, and the cellar had been cleared out. They took my statement and even created a sketch of Nick based on my description, but it's been 3 years, and he's never been found. I still carry the physical and emotional scars from that terrifying experience. I've tried to move on, but the memories of those days in the cellar, the symbols, and Nick's cold, emotionless smile haunt me to this day. I no longer trust the solitude of nature, and the peace I once sought in the wilderness has been forever tainted by the horrors I endured.